me not see it.
I don't know if I can even describe the way a room feels when the air becomes too thick to breathe, but that's where this starts. You know that feeling when you're deeply underwater and the pressure starts pushing against your eardrums until they feel like they're going to pop? That's what the air in my apartment felt like toward the end. Only it wasn't water. It was time. I'd signed up for this trial because the money was decent and the recruiter made it sound like I was doing something for the future of humanity. Chronos 7. That was the name. It was supposed to be the ultimate fix for the way we fall apart as we get older. A way to tell your cells to just stop decaying. To stay exactly as they are. For the first few days, I felt like a god. I'm not even kidding. I'd look in the mirror and the tiny lines around my eyes were just gone. My skin had this glow to it, like I was permanently caught in the best lighting possible. Even my knees, which usually cracked every time I stood up, felt fluid and effortless. I felt like I was being reset to my factory settings. I remember calling a friend and joking that I was going to live forever while they all turned into raisins. I wish I could go back and punch myself for saying that. Everything changed when the rebound started. It wasn't a slow slide back into being a normal guy. It was a violent, physical correction. I woke up in total darkness. At first, I thought I'd just slept through the day and the sun had gone down, but when I tried to look around, I realized I couldn't open my eyes. It wasn't that I was tired. It was that something was physically preventing my eyelids from lifting. I reached up with a hand that felt strangely clumsy and dull, and my fingers met something soft and folded. My eyelids had lost every bit of their elasticity. They had stretched and sagged so far down that the skin was literally resting on my cheekbones, draping over my eyes like wet, thick curtains of leather. I panicked. I sat up too fast and heard a sound from inside my own mouth that I will never forget. It was a wet, rattling clatter. I tried to gasp, to shout for help, but as my jaw unhinged, my teeth just gave up. They didn't ache or bleed at first. They just slipped out of my gums as if the bone holding them had turned to soft wax. I felt them tumbling over my tongue, smooth and hard, hitting the hardwood floor with a sound like dry corn kernels being scattered. One after another, they just fell away, leaving my mouth feeling cavernous and empty. I scrambled out of bed, tripping over my own feet. My skin felt loose, as if I were wearing a suit that was 3 sizes too big for me. Every time I moved, I could feel the friction of my own flesh sliding over the muscle beneath. It was a disgusting, sliding sensation. I made it to the bathroom by feeling along the wall, my fingers leaving streaks of something greasy on the paint. I needed to see. I used my fingers to physically hook the folds of my eyelids and hoist them upward so I could look into the mirror. The person looking back wasn't me. It wasn't even a human being anymore. My face was a melting candle of translucent, yellowed skin. The drug hadn't just stopped working, it had created a vacuum, and now time was rushing back in to fill the void with a vengeance. I watched, paralyzed, as a new wrinkle carved itself across my forehead in real time. It didn't just appear, the skin actually split and folded inward, a deep, bloodless trench forming right before my eyes. My nose was beginning to droop toward my chin, the cartilage softening and losing its shape. I could smell it then. It wasn't a smell of rot, not exactly. It was the smell of a basement that hasn't been opened in 100 years, a suffocating, dusty, stagnant scent of ancient dust and old, dried-out biological matter. It was the smell of a body that had been dead for decades, except I was still breathing. I was still inside it. I tried to run for the door, but my legs buckled. My bones felt like they were made of wet cardboard. I collapsed in the hallway, and as I hit the floor, the impact caused the skin on my forearms to just tear. It didn't tear like a normal wound. It tore like old parchment, thin and brittle. There was no bright red blood, just a dark, viscous sludge that moved like molasses, oozing out of the cracks in my limbs. It had a sharp, metallic tang to it, something that reminded me of rusted iron left out in the rain for too long. I crawled toward my phone, but my vision was failing. The world was turning into a gray, blurred smudge. My hearing was going, too. Everything sounded like it was happening behind a thick stone wall. I could feel my internal organs shifting, losing their anchor points as the connective tissue simply dissolved. A profound, crushing pressure settled over my chest. It wasn't a weight, it was an inward pull, as if my very soul was being sucked into a black hole located in the center of my stomach. I managed to catch a glimpse of my reflection in the dark glass of the oven door as I dragged myself through the kitchen. My hair was falling out in huge, snowy clumps, covering the floor around me. My ears had elongated and shriveled, pressed tight against a skull that was becoming visible through skin so thin it was practically clear. I looked like a centenarian who had been left to mummify in the desert sun. Every second felt like a year. I could feel the minerals leaching out of my bones, leaving them porous and snapping under the simple tension of my muscles. I heard my ribs crack just from the act of taking a breath. The pain was beyond anything I can describe. It was a deep, structural agony, the feeling of a billion cells screaming as they were forcibly aged into dust. I reached the front door and tried to grab the handle, but my fingers wouldn't obey. They were gnarled, twisted things now, the joints swollen into huge, arthritic knots that refused to bend. I slumped against the wood, my face pressed against the cold surface. I could feel my heart slowing down, each beat a massive, labored effort, like a rusted pump trying to move sludge. That's when I saw the folder. It must have fallen out of my bag when I came home the night before. It was the informational packet from the clinic. My blurred eyes focused just enough to see the handwritten note scrawled on the back of the last page by the lead researcher. It wasn't a medical observation. It was a death sentence. The note said that subject 42, that was me, had reached the biological limit of the human frame. It noted that the total elapsed trial time was only 14 hours. But because of the way the drug had folded time back on itself, my internal biological age was now 104 years. I'm laying here now, and I can feel the end coming. It's not a peaceful fading away. It's a violent collapse. My lungs feel like they're filled with dry sand. Every time I try to inhale, I can feel the delicate tissues inside me fracturing. I can't even close my mouth because my jaw has locked in a wide, toothless O. The worst part is that I'm still conscious. My brain is the only thing the drug is still holding on to, keeping me sharp and aware as my body turns into a pile of ancient, discarded leather and brittle sticks. I can feel the house settling around me, the floorboards creaking, and I know that by the time someone finds me, there won't be enough of me left to put in a coffin. I'll just be a stain on the floor, a heap of clothes filled with dust, and the memory of a man who tried to cheat the clock. The air is getting colder. I can feel my pulse fluttering in my neck, thin and weak like a dying bird's wing. I just wanted to stay young. I just wanted a little more time. But time is a debt, and eventually, the universe comes to collect everything you owe, plus interest. I can hear the clock on the wall ticking, and with every single click, I feel another decade slipping through my broken fingers.
Next story.
The thing about working as a paramedic is that you get used to the smell of death pretty quickly. You learn to categorize it. There's the sharp, chemical tang of a fresh suicide, the bloating sweetness of a floater found in a river, and that thick, suffocating rot of someone who's been sitting in a heated apartment for a week. But when we kicked in the door to that third-floor dorm, the air that hit us didn't fit any of the categories. It wasn't wet or heavy. It was bone dry. It felt like sticking your head into a bag of cement mix or opening a trunk that's been sealed in a desert attic for a century. It sucked the moisture right out of my throat, making me gag on a cloud of fine, gray silt that was hanging in the air like a fog. My partner, Miller, was a 20-year veteran, a guy who had seen people turned inside out by car accidents without blinking. He took one step into that room and stopped dead, his hand hovering over his radio. The room was perfectly neat. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood on the walls, just a mountain of that gray dust coating every surface like a fresh layer of fallen snow. On the bed, tucked neatly under a thin duvet, was a shape that made my brain stall out. We were there for a wellness check on Sarah, a junior who had missed 3 days of exams. Her parents were frantic. They said she was a straight-A student, totally healthy, no history of drugs or mental health issues. I expected to find a girl who had maybe taken too many pills or had a silent aneurysm. I didn't expect to find a relic. The thing on the bed was wearing a navy blue hoodie with Class of 2027 printed across the chest in bright yellow letters. But the person inside that hoodie was gone. In her place was a skeletal figure draped in skin that looked like brown parchment. It was stretched so tight over the cheekbones that the skin had split, revealing teeth that were yellowed and brittle. Her eyes were sunken deep into the skull, turned into 2 hard, black raisins. Her hands were curled over the blanket, the fingernails incredibly long and jagged, yellowed like old ivory. She looked exactly like those bog bodies you see in museums, preserved and withered by thousands of years of peat and time. Miller finally found his voice, but it was thin and reedy. He whispered that it had to be a mannequin or some kind of sick joke. He reached out, his gloved hand trembling, and touched the mummy's wrist. I watched as the parchment-thin skin simply crumbled under his finger, turning into a pinch of that same gray powder. There was no blood. There were no fluids left in her at all. She was a biological husk, a human being who had been completely desiccated. We stood there in that suffocating silence for a long time, just staring at the hoodie. The fabric was brand new. It still had the crispness of something recently washed. The contrast between that modern, synthetic cloth and the ancient, crumbling remains inside it was enough to make my stomach turn. I felt a sense of profound wrongness, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They were just as baffled as we were. The lead detective, a guy named Vance, kept pacing the small room, his boots kicking up little swirls of the gray dust. He pointed at the nightstand. There was a digital alarm clock there, but it wasn't working right. The numbers were flickering in a frantic, strobe-like blur. Next to it was an old-fashioned analog watch, the kind with a physical ticking hand. I leaned in to look at it and felt a wave of vertigo hit me. The second hand wasn't ticking once per second. It was spinning so fast it looked like a propeller, a silver blur that hummed with a low, vibrating energy. While the forensics team began the grim task of bagging what was left of Sarah, Vance took us down to the security office to look at the hallway tapes. This is the part that still keeps me awake, the part that makes me check the clocks in my house every single time I walk into a room. The footage was clear. Sarah walked toward her room at exactly 8 in the evening. She was carrying a bag of takeout and looking at her phone. She looked happy. She looked alive. She swiped her keycard, entered the room, and closed the door behind her. The hallway was empty for the next few minutes. Then, at 8:15, the camera's microphone picked up a sound that I can only describe as a scream, but it wasn't human. It was a high-pitched, grinding noise, like a massive drill bit hitting a sheet of steel. It was a sound of extreme friction. As the sound peaked, we saw it on the video, a thick, silent plume of gray powder began to puff out from the gap beneath her door. It came out in pulses, as if something inside was breathing out a cloud of pulverized remains. The screaming lasted for exactly 60 seconds. During that minute, the digital timestamp on the bottom of the security footage started to glitch. It jumped from 8:15 to 8:45, then back to 8:16, then accelerated, the seconds flying by in a blur that matched the watch on Sarah's nightstand. When the sound stopped, the hallway went silent again. The powder stopped puffing out from under the door. For the next 3 days, until we arrived, nothing else entered or left that room. The coroner's report came back a week later, and it only made things worse. They did a DNA test on the remains, and it was a perfect match for Sarah. But when they performed a bone density scan and looked at the cellular decay, they told us the body belonged to someone who had been dead for at least 90 to 100 years. Her internal organs were nothing but shriveled, fibrous threads. Her lungs were filled with that same gray dust, which the lab identified as a mixture of pulverized calcium and carbon. Basically, her own body had been ground down into silt from the inside out. The most gut-wrenching detail was her mouth. When the medical examiner forced the jaw open, he found that her tongue had been worn down to a tiny, hard nub of gristle. It looked as though she had spent years, or what felt like years to her, screaming in that room, the sheer passage of time eroding her away while the rest of the world only saw a minute pass on the clock. I quit the force a month after that call. I couldn't handle the way people looked at me, and I couldn't handle the dreams. I keep thinking about what it must have felt like for her. To be standing in your room, maybe reaching for a fry from your takeout bag, and then suddenly the world shifts. You feel your skin start to tighten and crack. You feel your hair growing long, then brittle, then falling out in clumps. You feel your muscles wasting away to nothing while you try to reach for the door, but your legs are already too weak to carry you. She must have lived an entire lifetime in those 60 seconds. She watched the sun rise and set through the cracks in the blinds thousands of times in the span of a single minute. She starved, she thirsted, and she aged in a relentless, agonizing acceleration of reality. I live in a small house now, far away from the city. I don't have any digital clocks. I don't have any watches. But sometimes, when the house is very quiet, I think I can hear a faint, metallic humming coming from the walls. It's a vibration, a sense of something moving too fast just out of sight. And every morning, when I wake up, I check the top of my dresser for dust. If I see even a tiny speck of that fine, gray powder, I don't breathe. I just stand there, frozen, waiting to see if the second hand of the world is about to start spinning.
Next story.
I've spent the last few weeks trying to find a way to explain this without sounding like I've completely lost my mind, but the truth is, I don't think it matters anymore. You know that apartment I moved into last year? The one with the high ceilings and the drafty windows that always smelled like damp wood and old paper? I loved that place until I found that vanity. It was tucked away in a corner of the basement storage unit, buried under a moth-eaten tarp that looked like it hadn't been touched since the house was built. I remember pulling the fabric back and feeling this immediate, intense pull toward it. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost aggressive. The wood was a dark, polished mahogany, and the glass was perfect. It didn't have that silver pitting or the waviness you usually see in antiques. It was clear as deep water. I dragged it up to my bedroom and spent hours cleaning the grime off the frame. As soon as I set it up against the wall across from my bed, I noticed something strange. When I looked at myself in that mirror, I didn't see the tired, stressed-out version of me that usually stared back from the bathroom mirror. My skin looked flawless. The dark circles under my eyes were gone, replaced by a healthy, vibrant glow. I looked like I'd just woken up from the best sleep of my life, even though I'd been working 60 hours a week. It was addictive. I started spending more time in front of that vanity than I did anywhere else in the apartment. I'd sit there for hours, brushing my hair or just staring, mesmerized by how right I looked. Everything else in my life started to feel dull by comparison. When I went to work or looked in a shop window, I felt gray and diminished. But the second I stepped back into my bedroom and sat on that velvet stool, I was radiant. I felt like I was finally becoming the person I was always meant to be. I didn't notice the changes in the room at first. You don't notice the rot when you're looking at a masterpiece. But the air in the bedroom started to get thin. It felt dry, like the moisture was being sucked out of the walls. There was this lingering scent that started to crawl under the door, a thick, cloying smell of stagnant water and wet earth, like a basement that had been flooded and left to fester for decades. I ignored it because I was too busy watching my reflection. My eyes in the glass were so bright they almost seemed to pulse with their own light. The turning point happened on a night when the moon was hitting the glass at a sharp angle. I was leaning in close, checking a small line on my forehead that seemed to be vanishing right before my eyes. I reached out to adjust the side panel of the mirror, tilting it just a few inches to the left. For a split second, the angle shifted enough that I wasn't looking at my face anymore. I was looking past my reflection's shoulder into the room behind her. My heart didn't just skip a beat, it felt like it hit a wall. In the mirror, the room behind the beautiful me was a nightmare. The wallpaper wasn't just peeling, it was liquefying, sliding off the drywall in gray, slimy sheets. The floorboards were turning to black silt. The ceiling was sagging, dripping with a thick, viscous mold that looked like it was breathing. I froze. I looked over my shoulder at the actual room behind me. My bedroom was fine. The paint was intact, and the carpet was clean. But when I looked back into the glass, the decay was accelerating. It was moving at light speed. I watched as the dresser in the reflection crumbled into a pile of gray dust in a matter of seconds. I realized then that the mirror wasn't some magical fountain of youth. It wasn't giving me anything. It was a vacuum. It was siphoning the life, the structural integrity, and the very essence of my physical world to fuel that shimmering, perfect image in the glass. Every time I felt a spark of beauty, a piece of my reality was being ground into nothingness. A wave of pure, cold terror washed over me. I needed to get away from it. I needed to break it. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt stiff, not just stiff, but brittle. It felt like my bones had been replaced with dry chalk. I grabbed a heavy bronze candle holder from the vanity top, intending to smash the glass into 1,000 pieces. I swung my arm with everything I had, but as soon as the momentum shifted, I heard a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. It wasn't a snap. It was a dry, hollow crunch, like someone stepping on a bundle of dead twigs in the middle of winter. My right arm didn't just break, it shattered. The skin, which looked so supple in the reflection, tore open like old parchment paper. There was no blood. There was no metallic scent. Instead, a cloud of fine, gray dust puffed out of the wound. I looked down and saw the white, porous marrow of my bone exposed to the air. My entire body felt light, not in a good way, but in a way that suggested I had no density left. I was a husk. I was a shell of a human being held together by nothing but habit and the mirror's gaze. I collapsed back onto the stool, my shattered arm hanging limp at my side, leaking more of that gray ash onto my lap. I looked up at the mirror one last time. The girl in the glass wasn't mimicking me anymore. She wasn't holding a broken arm. She was standing up, smooth and perfect, her skin glowing with a warmth that felt like a physical insult to my decaying state. She looked down at me with a smile that was far too wide, far too hungry. She placed her hands against the surface of the glass from the inside. The mirror didn't ripple like water, it stretched like a membrane, becoming thin and translucent. I tried to scream, but my lungs felt like they were filled with sawdust. Each breath I took was agonizing, a dry rasp that felt like sandpaper rubbing against my throat. I watched, paralyzed, as her fingers began to emerge from the glass. They didn't look like glass fingers, they looked like real, living flesh. She pushed her head through next, then her shoulders. The sound was like a snake shedding its skin, a wet, sliding noise that made my stomach turn. She stepped out onto the carpet of my bedroom, her bare feet making a soft, solid thud on the floor. She stood over me for a moment, looking down at the pile of brittle bone and grayish that I had become. She reached out and touched my cheek with a finger that felt impossibly warm. Where she touched me, my skin simply flaked away, falling into my lap like dead leaves. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She just leaned down, picked up my favorite sweater from the floor, and pulled it over her head. She moved with a grace that I had forgotten I ever possessed. I watched through eyes that were becoming clouded and dry as she walked toward the bedroom door. She paused at the threshold, turned back, and gave me a small, mocking wave, the kind of wave you give a stranger you'll never see again. Then she walked out. I heard the front door click shut. I heard her heels clicking down the hallway of the apartment building, a sound that grew fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the silence of the room. Now, I'm just sitting here. The sun is going down, and the shadows are getting longer. I can feel the weight of my own head becoming too much for my neck to support. Every time I try to shift my weight, I hear another small crack, another piece of me turning to dust. I can see myself in the mirror again, but the glass is empty now. There's no one there. Just the reflection of a room that is rotting away at light speed, even though I know the walls around me are still solid. I'm the debt that's being collected. I'm the price for the beauty she took. I don't think it will be long now. The wind from the open window is picking up, and I can feel myself starting to drift. I'm not dying, not exactly. I'm just being blown away, one grain of gray ash at a time, until there's nothing left in this chair but a memory of a girl who wanted to look perfect.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.